My name is Detective Robert Mills, and I have been working with the Detroit Police Department for 13 years now, and in all those years I have seen hundreds of criminals come through our station, but there is one man whose story stays with me, because he was not a career criminal or a bad person, but just an ordinary working man who made one terrible decision that destroyed his entire life. And when I tell you this story, I want you to understand that sometimes good people make bad choices, and sometimes those choices have consequences that last forever. I met Danny Mora on a cold February evening in 2017 when we pulled over a truck on I-94 and searched it and found $50,000 worth of stolen construction equipment, and Danny was sitting in the driver's seat. And when we arrested him, he did not resist or run or fight, and he just put his hands up and started crying and said, "I am so sorry, officer, and I needed the money for my kids, and I made a mistake." We brought Danny to the station, and as I processed his arrest, I could see that he was not like the hardened criminals we usually dealt with. And he had no criminal record, and he was a construction worker, and he kept asking if he could call his wife because she would be worried. And there was something about him that made me want to hear his story. So after we booked him, I sat down with Danny in the interrogation room, and I said, "Danny, you are facing serious charges here and receiving stolen property and transportation of stolen goods, and these are felonies, and you could be looking at 5 to 10 years in prison." And Danny started crying again and said, "I know, officer, and I know I messed up, but I need you to understand why I did it." I said, "Okay, Danny, tell me your story." And Danny took a deep breath and began to talk. And over the next 3 hours, he told me about his life and his family and the desperate situation that had led him to commit a crime. For the first time in his 35 years, Danny Mora was born in Detroit in 1982, and his parents had immigrated from Mexico in the 1970s, looking for work and a better life. And Danny's father worked in an auto factory, and his mother cleaned houses. And they lived in a small house on the east side of Detroit, and money was always tight, but they were happy. Danny grew up watching his father work long hours and come home exhausted, and his father would tell him, "You need to work hard in this country, and nothing comes easy, and if you want to provide for your family, you need to be willing to do whatever it takes." And Danny learned from his father that work was honor, and that providing for your family was the most important thing a man could do. Danny was not a great student, and he struggled in school and barely graduated from high school, but he was good with his hands, and he was strong and reliable. And when he was 18, he got a job working construction, and he started out as a laborer doing the hardest and dirtiest work, but he never complained, and he showed up every day on time and worked harder than anyone else. When Danny was 23, he met Carmen at a church social, and she was working as a cashier at a supermarket, and she was beautiful and kind, and they fell in love quickly and got married within a year. And Danny promised Carmen that he would always take care of her and that she would never have to worry about anything. They had their first child, Maria, when Danny was 25, and then 2 years later they had their son, Miguel, and 2 years after that they had their youngest daughter, Sofia. And Danny loved being a father, and he would come home from work covered in dust and dirt and his muscles aching, but the moment he saw his children run to greet him, all the pain disappeared. Danny worked construction for 15 years, and he was good at what he did, and he was reliable, and his bosses liked him because he never missed a day, and he never caused problems, and he just showed up and did the work, and the pay was not great, but it was steady, and he was making about $120 to $150 a day depending on the job. Carmen worked at the supermarket making $11 an hour, and between the two of them they brought home about $40,000 a year, and it was not much, but they managed, and they rented a small 2-bedroom house in a working class neighborhood, and the kids shared bedrooms, and they did not have much, but they had each other. Life was hard, but it was good, and Danny would wake up at 5 in the morning and make coffee and pack his lunch and kiss Carmen and the kids goodbye and head to whatever construction site he was working on that day, and he would spend 8 or 9 hours lifting and carrying and building, and then come home exhausted and help the kids with homework and have dinner with his family. The work was hard on Danny's body, and his back hurt, and his knees hurt, and his hands were rough and scarred. But he never complained, because this was what a man did. And you worked hard, and you provided for your family, and you did not ask for sympathy Danny had a friend at work named Carlos, who had been working construction for 20 years, and Carlos was a good worker, but he was also involved in some things that Danny tried to stay away from. And Carlos would sometimes talk about easy money and quick jobs, and Danny would always say no thanks. Man, and I am happy with honest work. But in the winter of 2016, everything started to fall apart, and construction work slows down in Michigan. Winters, because you cannot do much building when the ground is frozen and the weather is terrible. And Danny found himself with less and less work, and some weeks he would only get 2 or 3 days of work instead of 5 or 6. The loss of income hit hard, and Carmen was still working her cashier job, but her hours got cut because the supermarket was not doing well, and suddenly they were bringing home maybe half of what they normally made, and the bills kept coming, and the rent was $850 a month, and they had electricity and water and phone bills, and the kids needed food and clothes and school supplies. Danny tried to find other work, but there was nothing, and he would go to different construction sites looking for day labor, but everyone was in the same situation, and there were more workers than jobs, and Danny started to panic because he had never been unable to provide for his family before. They fell behind on rent, and their landlord, Mr. Peterson, was not a patient man, and he came to their door and said, "Danny, you are 2 months behind, and that is $1,700, and I need that money or you need to move out." And Danny said, "Please, Mr. Peterson and I am looking for work, and I will get you the money." But Mr. Peterson said, "I have bills too, and I cannot wait forever." Carmen tried to be strong, but Danny could see the worry in her eyes, and one night, after the kids were asleep, she said to Danny, "What are we going to do when we have $60 left, and I need to buy groceries?" And Danny said, "I will figure something out, and I promise everything will be okay," but he did not know how he was going to keep that promise. Then in January, their youngest daughter, Sofia, got sick, and she developed a high fever, and she was crying and clearly in pain. And Carmen said, "We need to take her to the doctor," but they did not have health insurance because construction jobs do not provide benefits, and Carmen's supermarket job only offered insurance to full-time employees, and she was part-time. They took Sofia to the emergency room because they did not know what else to do, and the ER visit cost $800, and they did not have $800, and the hospital said they would send a bill, and Danny said yes, thank you, and he knew it was another debt they could not pay. The doctor said Sofia had a bad ear infection and gave them antibiotics and said she would be fine, but Danny looked at the prescription, and it cost $65, and he had to choose between buying the medicine his daughter needed and buying food for the week, and he bought the medicine, and they ate rice and beans. For the next 5 days, Danny felt like he was drowning, and every day brought new problems and new bills and new worries, and he would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling and thinking about his father and about what his father would do, and his father had always found a way, and his father had always provided, and Danny felt like he was failing. In early February, Mr. Peterson came back, and he had an eviction notice in his hand, and he said, "Danny, I am sorry, but I gave you time, and you have not paid, and you need to be out in 3 days." And Danny begged and said, "Please give me 1 more week, and I will have the money." And Mr. Peterson said, "I have heard that before, and the answer is no." Carmen cried when Danny told her they were being evicted, and she said, "Where will we go, and what about the kids and their school?" And Danny held her and said, "I will fix this, and I will get the money somehow." And Carmen said, "How?" And Danny said, "I do not know, but I will figure it out." The next day, Danny went to work, and there was not much work to do, and he spent most of the day standing around with the other workers, hoping someone would need an extra hand. And that is when Carlos came up to him and said, "Danny, you look like hell, and what is going on?" Danny told Carlos about the eviction, and about Sofia being sick, and about having no money, and Carlos listened, and nodded, and then said, "I might be able to help you." And Danny said, "How?" And Carlos said, "I have a job, and it is easy work, and it pays $2,000 for 1 night. Danny immediately felt suspicious, and said, "What kind of job?" And Carlos said, "You just have to drive a truck from point A to point B." And Danny said, "What is in the truck?" And Carlos said, "You do not ask questions, and that is part of the deal." And Danny said, "That sounds illegal." And Carlos said, "I did not say that, and I just said you do not ask questions." Danny said, "No thanks, man, and I cannot get involved in anything illegal." And Carlos shrugged and said, okay, but the offer stands. And if you change your mind, let me know, and $2,000. Cash and no questions asked, and Danny walked away, but the number kept echoing in his head, and $2,000 would solve everything. That night, Danny could not sleep, and he kept thinking about the $2,000, and with $2,000 he could pay the rent and keep his family in their home and buy groceries and pay the hospital bill and have some left over for emergencies. And it was so tempting. Danny thought about what his father would do, and he knew his father would say never break the law and work hard and be honest, and that is how a man provides, but his father had never been in this situation, and his father had always had work and had always been able to provide. And Danny did not have those options. For 2 days, Danny wrestled with the decision, and he told himself that he could not do it and that it was wrong and that he would find another way, but he could not find another way, and Mr. Peterson was serious, and they were going to be evicted, and his children were going to be homeless, and Danny felt desperate. On the 3rd day, Carlos found Danny again and said, so have you thought about it? And Danny stood there for a long moment and then said, tell me more about this job. And Carlos smiled and said, I knew you would come around. Carlos explained that a truck needed to be driven from a warehouse on the east side of Detroit to another warehouse in Dearborn, and it was maybe a 30-minute drive, and Danny would get paid $2,000 cash, and Carlos said the truck is loaded and ready to go, and all you have to do is drive it and drop it off and walk away. Danny asked what was in the truck, and Carlos said, I told you and you do not ask questions, and Danny said, but is it drugs? And Carlos said, no, and it is not drugs, and it is just equipment, and Danny said, stolen equipment, and Carlos did not answer, and Danny knew the truth. Danny said, I do not know if I can do this, and Carlos said, listen, Danny, and I know you are a good guy, and I know this is hard for you, but sometimes good guys have to do things they do not want to do, and your kids need you, and your wife needs you, and this is how you help them. And Danny felt sick to his stomach, but he said, okay, and when do I do it? Carlos said tonight, and meet me at the warehouse at 8 p.m., and Danny agreed, and he went home, and he did not tell Carmen what he was going to do, because he did not want her to know, and he played with his kids and helped them with homework, and tried to act normal, but inside he felt like he was betraying everything he believed in. At 8 p.m., Danny drove to the warehouse, and Carlos was waiting with another man. Danny did not know, and they showed Danny the truck, and it was a plain, white moving truck, and Carlos handed him the keys and an address, written on a piece of paper, and said, drive here and park the truck and leave the keys under the floor mat and walk away, and in 2 days I will have your money. Danny got in the truck and started driving, and his hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and he kept telling himself it is just one time. And after this, I will never do anything illegal again, and I will get my family back on track, and everything will be okay. But Danny could not shake the feeling that this was wrong, and he knew that what was in the back of that truck was stolen, and he knew that by driving it, he was committing a crime, and he thought about turning around. But then he thought about his kids being homeless, and he kept driving. Danny was about halfway to the destination when he saw the flashing lights behind him. Danny's heart dropped when he saw the police lights flashing behind him, and for a moment he thought about stepping on the gas and trying to run, but he knew that would only make things worse, and so he pulled over to the side of the highway and put his hands on the steering wheel and waited. A police officer approached the driver's side window, and Danny rolled it down, and the officer said, license and registration, please, and Danny's hands were shaking as he handed over his documents, and the officer looked at them and said, do you know why I pulled you over? And Danny said, no, sir, and the officer said, your left tail light is out. Danny felt a tiny bit of relief and thought maybe this would just be a warning and he could fix the taillight and continue on, but then the officer said, whose truck is this? And Danny said, it belongs to a friend, and I am just helping him move some stuff. And the officer looked at Danny suspiciously and said, what kind of stuff? Danny said, just equipment and construction equipment, and the officer said, can you show me the registration for this vehicle? And Danny realized he did not have it, and Carlos had not given him any paperwork, and Danny said, I do not have it with me, and the officer's expression hardened, and he said, step out of the vehicle, please. Danny got out of the truck, and another police car had arrived, and now there were 2 officers, and one of them said, we are going to need to search this vehicle." And Danny felt panic rising, and he said, "Do you need a warrant?" And the officer said, "Not if we have probable cause, and this vehicle has no registration, and you cannot prove you have permission to drive it." The officers opened the back of the truck, and Danny knew it was over, and inside were power tools and generators and copper wire and welding equipment and boxes of construction materials. And one of the officers said, "Where did you get all this?" And Danny said, "It belongs to my friend." And the officer said, "What friend? And give me his name and address." Danny stood there, and he knew he could not give up Carlos because Carlos would never forgive him, and because Danny did not really know where Carlos lived, and he just said, "I cannot tell you that." And the officer said then, "You are under arrest for receiving stolen property and transportation of stolen goods." They handcuffed Danny and read him his rights and put him in the back of the patrol car. And as they drove to the station, Danny thought about Carmen and about his kids and about how he was supposed to protect them and provide for them, and instead he had just destroyed their lives. At the station, they processed Danny and took his fingerprints and his photo and put him in a holding cell, and Danny sat there in shock, unable to believe this was happening, and he kept thinking, "This cannot be real, and this must be a nightmare, and I will wake." After a few hours, they brought Danny to an interrogation room, and that is where I met him, and I introduced myself and explained the charges. And Danny just broke down and told me everything, and he told me about his family and about being behind on rent and about Sofia being sick and about Carlos offering him the job and about making the terrible decision to say yes. I listened to Danny's story, and I felt bad for him because I could see that he was not a criminal and he was just a desperate father who had made a bad choice, but I also knew that the law was the law and that Danny had committed a crime and there would be consequences. I asked Danny if he would be willing to give us information about Carlos and about where the stolen equipment came from, and Danny hesitated and then said, "I do not know much, and Carlos never told me details." And I just drove the truck, and I asked if he would wear a wire and help us catch Carlos, and Danny said, "I cannot do that. And if Carlos finds out, he will hurt my family." I understood Danny's fear, but without his cooperation, it was going to be harder to build a case against the people who were really running the operation, and Danny was just the driver and the bottom of the food chain, but he was the one who got caught. They let Danny make a phone call, and he called Carmen. And when she answered, he started crying and said, "Carmen, I am so sorry, and I am in jail." And Carmen said, "What? And what happened?" And Danny tried to explain, but he was crying so hard he could barely speak, and Carmen said, "I am coming down there." Carmen arrived at the station an hour later, and she brought their oldest daughter, Maria, who was 9 years old because she had no one to watch. The kids and I let them see Danny through the glass, and Carmen was crying, and Maria was confused and scared, and Danny pressed his hand against the glass and said, "I am so sorry, and I was trying to help us." The bail hearing was the next day, and the prosecutor argued that Danny was a flight risk because he was facing serious felony charges, and Danny's public defender argued that Danny had no criminal record and was not dangerous and had strong ties to the community, but the judge set bail at $20,000. $20,000 might as well have been $20 million because Danny did not have it, and neither did Carmen, and they could not afford a bail bondsman, and so Danny stayed in jail waiting for his trial. Carmen visited Danny every week, and she would bring the kids when she could, and Danny would try to be strong for them, but it was so hard. Seeing his children on the other side of the glass and knowing he could not hug them or tuck them in at night or help them with their homework. Carmen had to move out of their house because she could not pay the rent alone, and she and the kids moved into a homeless shelter, and it broke Danny's heart to know that the very thing he had tried to prevent by taking that job had happened anyway, and his family was homeless because of his choices. The shelter was crowded and noisy, and his kids had to sleep on cots and share a bathroom with dozens of other people, and Maria started having nightmares, and Miguel became withdrawn and quiet, and Sofia cried all the time asking for her. Daddy and Carmen tried to hold everything together, but she was exhausted. Danny's trial took place 4 months after his arrest, and the evidence against him was clear and straightforward, and he had been caught driving a truck full of stolen property, and there was no way to deny it. And his public defender advised him to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. The prosecutor offered a deal, and if Danny pled guilty to receiving stolen property and transportation of stolen goods, he would get 5 years in prison instead of the 10 years he could get if convicted at trial, and Danny's lawyer said you should take this deal and 5 years is better than 10. Danny asked if there was any way to avoid prison time, and his lawyer said not with these charges and not with the amount of stolen property involved, and this was $50,000 worth of equipment. And the courts do not give probation for that, and Danny said, but I have never been in trouble before. And does that count? For anything, and the lawyer said it. Helps, but it is not enough. Danny decided to plead guilty because he did not want to put his family through a trial, and he did not want to risk getting 10 years, and he thought maybe with good behavior he could get out in 3 or 4 years and try to rebuild his life. At the sentencing hearing, the judge asked Danny if he had anything to say, and Danny stood up and said, "Your Honor, I know what I did was wrong, and I am not making excuses, but I want you to know that I was desperate, and my family was about to be evicted, and my daughter was sick, and I could not provide for them, and I made a terrible choice, and I regret it every day." The judge listened and then said, "Mr. Mora, I understand that you were in a difficult situation, but poverty does not give anyone the right to commit crimes, and if everyone who struggled financially turned to crime, our society would fall apart, and you chose to transport stolen property, and that property was taken from hardworking people and businesses, and they are victims too." The judge continued and said, "I have reviewed your record, and I see that you have no prior convictions, and that you have been a productive member of society and a devoted father, and I have taken that into consideration. But I also must consider the seriousness of your crime and the value of the stolen property, and therefore I am sentencing you to 5 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections." Danny felt his legs go weak, and 5 years meant his youngest daughter would be 9 years old when he got out, and Miguel would be 13, and Maria would be 14, and they would grow up without their father, and he would miss so much of their lives. Carmen was in the courtroom, and she started crying, and Maria was there too, and she ran up to the barrier and shouted, "Daddy, no, and please do not take my daddy." And the bailiffs had to gently pull her back, and Danny looked at his daughter and his wife and said, "I love you, and I am so sorry." They took Danny to prison, and he was sent to a medium security facility about 2 hours from Detroit, and the first weeks were the hardest, and Danny had never been in prison before, and he was terrified, and he did not know how to act or who to trust, and he just kept his head down and tried to stay out of trouble. Prison life was brutal, and Danny worked in the prison kitchen and earned 20 cents an hour, and he would save every penny so he could buy phone cards to call home and talk to Carmen and the kids, and those phone calls were the only thing that kept him going. Carmen struggled terribly on her own, and she was working 2 jobs now, and she got a second job cleaning offices at night, and she would work at the supermarket during the day and then clean offices from midnight to 4 in the morning and then sleep for a few hours and start over, and she was exhausted all the time. The kids suffered too, and they moved from the shelter to a tiny subsidized apartment, and it was in a rough neighborhood, and the schools were not good, and Maria started hanging out with the wrong kids, and Miguel became very quiet and stopped doing his homework, and Sofia still asked every day when Daddy was coming home. Carmen brought the kids to visit Danny once a month, and it was a 2-hour drive each way and expensive because of gas, and they had to go through security and wait in long lines, and then they only got 30 minutes to visit, and it was never enough time. During these visits, Danny would try to make conversation and ask about school and friends, and he would try to give advice and be a father, but it was impossible to parent from behind glass, and the kids grew more distant each time. And Maria started refusing to come, and she would say, "What is the point? And he is not here anyway." After Danny had served 2 years, he had a parole hearing, and his public defender helped him prepare and told him to show remorse and talk about rehabilitation. And Danny appeared before the parole board and explained that he had taken classes in prison and stayed out of trouble, and that he wanted to go home to his family. But the parole board said that 5 years was already a reduced sentence, and that he needed to serve more time before they would consider early release, and Danny's parole was denied, and he would have to wait another year to try again. Danny went back to his cell and felt hopeless. And he had tried to do everything, right? And he had been a model prisoner, and it still was not enough. And he thought about how much more his family would have to suffer because of his one mistake. Carlos, the man who had given Danny the job and gotten him into this mess, was never caught, and he continued working construction and making money on the side with stolen goods. And one day, Carmen saw him at the grocery store, and she went up to him and said, "You destroyed my family." And Carlos just shrugged and said, "I did not force Danny to do anything, and he made his own choice." Carmen wanted to scream at him, but she just walked away because what was the point? And Carlos would never take responsibility and would never face consequences, and that was just how life worked, and the people at the bottom always paid the price, while the people at the top walked free. As I sit here today, Danny Mora has served 3 years of his 5-year sentence, and he has 2 years left, and he is now 38 years old, and when he gets out, his youngest daughter will be 11, and his son will be 15, and his oldest daughter will be 17. Carmen is still working 2 jobs and barely keeping her head above water, and the kids are growing up in poverty and without their father, and the cycle continues. And Danny's story is not unique, and I see it over and over again in good people making desperate choices and paying terrible prices. I think about Danny often and about how one bad decision destroyed his life, and I wonder if there was anything I could have done differently, and if there was any way to help him. But the truth is, the system does not have many options for people like Danny. Danny was not a bad person, but he committed a crime, and there had to be consequences. But 5 years seems like such a harsh punishment for a desperate father who was just trying to keep his family from being homeless, and yet the stolen equipment was worth $50,000, and it belonged to someone who had worked hard to earn it. This case taught me that the line between law-abiding citizen and criminal can be very thin, and that circumstances can push good people to make terrible choices, and that poverty creates situations where people feel they have no good options. I also learned that the consequences of crime extend far beyond the person who commits it, and Danny is in prison, but his wife and children are serving their own sentence, and they are struggling and suffering and missing him, and they did nothing wrong, but they are being punished anyway. When I met Danny that night in 2017, I saw a broken man who was crying and apologizing and taking full responsibility for what he had done, and I believed him when he said he regretted it, and I believe him now. And Danny knows he made a terrible mistake, and he will pay for that mistake for the rest of his life. Even after he gets out of prison, Danny will have a felony record, and it will be nearly impossible for him to find good work, and most construction companies will not hire convicted felons, and he will struggle to support his family, and the cycle of poverty and desperation will continue. I wish I could say that this story has a happy ending, or that there is some lesson that makes it all make sense, but there is not. And this is just the reality for thousands of families across America, and people making impossible choices and facing harsh consequences and systems that do not have mercy. Danny Mora was an ordinary man who worked hard and loved his family and tried to do the right thing, and when he was pushed into a corner, he made one bad decision, and that decision cost him everything, and his family is still paying the price. If you are watching this, I want you to understand that this is not a story about a criminal, and this is a story about a father, and about what desperation can drive people to do, and about how our society fails people who are struggling and leaves them with no good options. Thank you for listening to Danny's story, and if it made you think about poverty and crime and consequences, then maybe some good can come from his suffering. And if you want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe, because there are many more that need to be told.